All right, guys. This is the third installment of the APUSH live series, coming right at you from my home. Just a quick uh, thing that we do. Can everybody hear me? Um, I've tried to set up the easel again to allow everybody to see what I'm talking about. I know it's not the best, but are there any modifications or changes I need to make before we get too much into it? So if you just would use the chat window to say, yeah, everything's fine, I can hear you. If there's any big changes I need to make, please let me know, and I'll wait for you guys to respond. All right, Xavier says everything's fine. I'll wait to see if she speaks for the group. All right. Cool. All right, well, I'm not really getting anybody saying that I have to change anything, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So this is going to be really similar to last night, where after I go through a particular period, I'll check the pop-up window, and if there's any questions or concerns, I'll go ahead and address them. The other thing, just remember on my blog, I have a Google Docs option where if you want to type in a question there, I'll answer that sometime tonight or tomorrow morning. Also on my blog, I have a link where there's a more in-depth site where you can look at these PowerPoint presentations, and they take the material a little bit more in depth. The purpose of this is just to kind of remind us of some major themes and ideas, and some examples that you could use to support that idea. So without further ado, we're going to pick it up where we left off last night. Period 4. This is it starts at the year 1800 and ends in 1848. So what's important about the year 1800? This is the election of Thomas Jefferson, the rise of the Democratic Republicans, or the Republicans. Remember, this is a peaceful transfer of power from the Federalists to the Republicans. Why 1848? Well, 1848 is the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. 1848 is the beginning of the hardcore sectionalism, where we'll enter the decade of crisis, which is the 1850s, and we'll start to see a set of circumstances that ultimately lead to civil war. So without further ado, let's look at some things that we need to know and remember about period 4. It takes up about 10% of your exam. So the first thing that we have to look at, why regional identities arose between the North, the South, and the West, and how the market revolution affected each region. So a couple of examples here that could be used to support the development of regional identities between the three regions, and how the market revolution affected each region. Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney is key for the South, and he is also pretty key for the North as well. Eli Whitney, in 1793, he will invent the cotton gin. The cotton gin is going to be fundamental for the South. This is an instrument that will allow for a more efficient harvesting of cotton. The removal of the seeds from the cotton plant. This is going to allow for an increase in the demand for slavery in the South. And Eli Whitney also is the creator or the inventor of the interchangeable parts. And this will be fundamental for the rise of industry, along with some other factors, but this will be fundamental for the rise of industry in the North. Interchangeable parts allows for mass production and the standardization of machine parts, and he will start that with the rifles, and he will later, or that idea of interchangeable parts will later flow through the American manufacturing plants up in the North. Some other reasons for the regional identities: we see the transportation revolution. We see the invention of the first steamboat by Robert Fulton in 1807. This is going to allow for transportation along the rivers upstream and downstream. So especially with the Mississippi River, the steam engine will be key. The transportation revolution, we also see the National Road. That's going to be finished in the early part of the 19th century. We see the rise of the canal system. The Erie Canal is going to be completed in 1825. The Erie Canal will connect the Great Lakes to New York City by way of the Hudson River. So what's important about the Erie Canal and the canal system and the transportation revolution in general is that we start to see the interior of the country being connected to the coast. And so you'll see the expansion of markets from the Atlantic seaboard into the what would be the Ohio Valley or the Midwest, and then vice versa. We'll start to see the expansion of markets for products and that were coming from the Midwest back east. Some other reasons for regional identities: we see the rise of immigration and nativism. With immigration, during this time, the two primary immigrant groups that you want to remember will be the Irish and the Germans. They're both coming over here during the 1830s and the 1840s. These will be, if you want to compare this to period 6, these will be the old immigrants. And then when we talk about period 6 later, we'll talk about the new immigrants. But some things that we want to remember about the two immigrant groups. The German immigrants, they're a little bit more well off when they're coming over, and so they have some money. And a lot of the German immigrants will actually they'll come into the port cities on the eastern coast, and then they'll actually move and settle in the Midwest. The Irish immigrants are coming over due to a potato famine, and they're poor, they're unskilled. So a lot of the Irish will settle into their port cities, New York City, Boston, so on. And this is going to give a rise to nativism. Nativism is this movement where we see it's anti-immigration. It's a support for Protestant Anglo-Saxon Americans. And we see a definite backlash against the Germans and the Irish with the rise of nativism. We will see a nativist party. The Know Nothing Party will be a nativist party that is short-lived, but in the 1840s and 1850s. Let's see here, and we'll see a rise of nativism again once in the last part of the 1880s and 1890s, and we'll see nativism again in the 1920s. Another reason why we see regional identities arising between the three regions, we see the early factory system. This is due to Francis Cabot Lowell, Lowell, and Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater will be the person primarily responsible for bringing the plans for the textile machines over from England. And Lowell will be the one that develops these mill towns. And so these mill towns will be located in the New England region. They will be primarily textile machines or textile factories. We'll see single young women working for the mill towns, and we'll start to see the development of an industrial-based economy in the North. Some other things that will cause for these regional identities to arise from between the North and the South and the West. The support and the opposition to slavery. With the cotton gin in the late 1790s, we'll see a revival of slavery. So as the South begins to identify with cotton, and they will become known as Cotton Kingdom, King Cotton, cotton diplomacy. We'll see the South kind of change their attitudes and their stance towards slavery from labeling it once a necessary evil to now in the 1830s and the 1840s, we'll see it be labeled as a positive good. And they'll try to contrast the conditions of a slave in the South to those of a factory worker in the North. And at the same time, as we see an increase in support of slavery, we'll start to see the rise of abolition or the abolitionist movement. And so this is going to be something that gives rise to sectionalism and definitely going to rear its ugly head big time in the 1850s, leading ultimately to the Civil War. The second thing that we need to remember about period 4 is how American society became more democratic for white men in the Jacksonian age, and how various social movements attempted to improve society. So with the age of Jackson, we talked about, when we look at more democratic, we start to see, the rise of individualism, the increased importance of the individual. We see an expansion of suffrage. So by the time Jackson gets into office in 1828, and then, again, when he wins re-election in 1832, we see by that time universal white male suffrage. At the same time, Native Americans are still disenfranchised. Women are still disenfranchised. African Americans who were at one time allowed to vote in these northern states are increasingly becoming disenfranchised. So, to what extent was American society becoming more democratic? That's something that you could possibly talk about. These social movements, we talked about these antebellum reform movements. It starts off with the Second Great Awakening. Last night we talked about the First Great Awakening happened in the 1730s and 40s. The Second Great Awakening is this, once again, it's a religious movement. It's happening in upstate New York, and then it kind of spreads into western New York and then into the interior of the country. With the Second Great Awakening, it is a it turns us back on the idea of predestination. All individuals are now able to gain salvation. We start to see the idea that the individual, once again, kind of the importance of the individual, the rise of individualism. We see that with the Second Great Awakening, that individuals now can go out and improve society. That we have a chance to create a perfect society. And out of the Second Great Awakening, you give rise to some of these reform movements. Abolition, we just talked about. Temperance, or the anti-alcohol movement. You'll see the American Temperance Union created during this time. The temperance movement is going to be something that continues throughout the 19th century, and then we finally see it achieve some success, right, or I guess a good deal of success in the early part of the 20th century with the 18th Amendment. But that's going to be something that we'll see in the Reform Movements area, and then it comes again during the Gilded Age and the Progressive era. The Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention is a great event or an example of the women's rights movement during this time period. For a lot of these reform movements, women were an instrumental part. But at the same time, women were confined to this idea of the code of domesticity, that there was a separate sphere for women, and they belonged in the house. They belonged their primary responsibility was to instill morals and values into their children. But with their increased participation in some of these reform movements, we see a women's rights movement arise. And Seneca Falls happened in 1848. It's the first women's rights convention. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were the leaders of the Seneca Falls Convention. And the seminal document that comes out of this convention was a Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments is modeled after the Declaration of Independence with some slight changes. All men and women are created equal, and they are demanding the right to vote. So we start to see the rise of women's suffrage in 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention. We have Horace Mann. He is an advocate for public education. If we're going to be a democratic Republican society, if we're going to be a Republican form of government, which citizens are, an instrumental part in the process, then we need an educated citizenry. And the way to ensure that would be through public education. Public education is going to take off in Massachusetts and New England, but it's a little slower, to spread, especially into the southern part of the United States. We have Dorothea Dix. I don't have this on here, but Dorothea Dix is going to be the reformer that we want to associate with prison reform. She's an advocate for mental health. So we start to see mental health or mental health hospitals and asylums during this time period. And then Jackson as president. Andrew Jackson wins in 1828. He wins again in 1832. And remember that Andrew Jackson is the hero of the common man. When he's doing things like the Indian Removal Act, he says that he's doing this to allow for the common man to expand into Georgia and to achieve some success. When he kills the Bank of the United States, he says he's doing this because the Bank of the United States is not good for the entirety of the country, that it's only looking out for the upper class and for the wealthy. And so he is seen as the hero of the common man. The third thing that we really want to focus on here for period 4, reasons for the growth of political parties. We saw the reasons for the emergence of political parties with period 3. But now we're starting to transition into the second party system. The first party system was with the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. But as a result of the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention, we'll see the death of the Federalist Party. And then with the second party system in the 1830s, it will be the Democrats versus the Whigs. And so the Whigs, remember, they were created and established primarily out of their hatred for Andrew Jackson. We looked at a political cartoon, King Andrew I. They were sick and tired of Andrew Jackson's excessive use of the veto. They said that he was acting more like a monarch than a president. And so the Whigs are going to support things like the National Bank. The Whigs will support things like internal improvements. The Whigs will support a lot of the same positions and stances that the Federalist Party of Alexander Hamilton supported in the 1790s. All right, some other things here for period 4 that we have to remember. All right. With period 4, we see the rise of slavery. We have to remember about the rise of slavery, which we've touched on slightly, and how slavery divided the country economically, socially, and politically. And we see the beginning of sectionalism. So a couple of things that help support that are some examples. Henry Clay's American system. Henry Clay's American system came right after the War of 1812, and it has 3 parts. Number 1, to protect these new and infant American manufacturers, we see the protective tariff of 1816. We see the call for internal improvements, roads and canals, and then we see the support for a national bank. So Henry Clay's American system, those 3 parts. But you think about this, how does slavery divide the country economically? Well, with the rise of cotton, we see the South form a trading partnership with Europe, namely Great Britain, and so they are getting their manufactured goods from Europe, and so they are going to be staunch opponents of this protective tariff of 1816. Once again, as they're getting their goods imported, the South doesn't really see a need to pay taxes for these internal improvements like roads and canals, and as a result, you see the North and the West are connected due to the American system, but the South is going to be primarily left out. And then with the National Bank, this goes back to why Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, were against the National Bank in the 1790s. The National Bank would really help out those that are in the business and commercial classes. The Tariff of Abominations. The Tariff of Abominations comes in 1828 at the very beginning of Jackson's presidency. The Tariff of Abomination raises tariffs on a lot of these imported goods that the South gets from Great Britain and from Europe. And so John C. Calhoun, when he sees that Jackson is going to support this tariff, John C. Calhoun resigns from his office of vice president, and he is going to lead South Carolina in a push to nullify these tariffs. The tariff of abominations will lead to the South Carolina nullification crisis, where South Carolina reintroduces the idea of nullification. Nullification is the idea that a state, if they believe a federal law is unconstitutional, they can nullify it or choose not to follow it. So this is really, it kind of bleeds into this one right here, how states challenge federal authority. Um, you know, who is the ultimate decider of whether or not to follow and to enforce a law? Is it going to be the states, or is it going to be the federal government? And so South Carolina takes a stance that the states can decide whether or not to follow a law or whether or not a law is constitutional. They do this because they believe that it's tariffs today, but later, if they don't take a stand against tariffs now in the late 1820s, 1830s, tomorrow it might be slavery. So the tariff of abominations in the South Carolina nullification crisis, it reaches a peak in 1833. Fortunately, Henry Clay comes up with a compromise tariff, which will put into place a series of reductions in the tariff rates. But Andrew Jackson, to make sure that his stance is known, he also gets passed the Force Act, which would allow the president to send down the military to make sure that the tariffs were enforced. The Bank of the United States, we've talked about how that divides the country. And the Missouri Compromise, the rise of slavery. The Missouri Compromise in 1820, this is going to be the first time that Congress has to deal with the expansion of slavery. This will be another issue that comes to light in the 1850s as we start talking about expansion and gaining territories. But the Missouri Compromise happens in 1820. Missouri wants to be admitted into the Union as a slave state. But if it is admitted into the Union as a slave state, it will upset the balance of power between slave states and free states in the Senate. So what are you going to do? Once again, Henry Clay comes up with a compromise. He says Missouri can come in as a slave state. Maine will come in as a free state to maintain that balance of power. And then with the rest of the territory that we got, which at this time would be the Louisiana territory, with the rest of the territory, the issue of slavery will be decided by the 3630 parallel, which is essentially splitting the country in half. Anything north of the 3630 parallel will be free. Anything south of the 3630 parallel would be slave. Let's see how states challenge federal authority, the supremacy of the federal government of the states. These are some other things that we need to remember. A good example of how states challenge federal authority is the Hartford Convention. This is coming on the heels of the War of 1812. It actually takes place in 1814, late 1814. A bunch of New England states meet in Hartford, Connecticut. They are going to voice their opposition to the War of 1812. They want to put into they debate and discuss issues of nullification. They actually bring up the issue of secession. If their demands are not met, and really the demands are that they want in the Hartford Convention are things to put into place that would diminish the influence of the South in American politics. Unfortunately for the members of the Hartford Convention and really for the Federalist Party, as their demands are being put together and being brought down to Washington, the War of 1812 is over by way of the Treaty of Ghent. And then the last battle of the War of 1812, which actually happens after the treaty is signed, the Battle of New Orleans happens, which is a huge victory for the Americans over the British. Andrew Jackson is a hero. We see the rising tide of nationalism sweep over the country. And so as nationalism is sweeping over the country, and as we see Americans leaving or exiting the War of 1812 with a pretty good taste in the mouth, they see the Federalist Party in New England push in a counter argument. And as a result of the Hartford Convention and its timing, we see the eventual death of the Federalist Party. By the time James Monroe runs for president and runs for re-election in 1820, he's essentially going to run unopposed. Let's see here. Some other things. Oh, we see in period 4, America is a world power, and I have like a question mark here. The War of 1812 could be an example of this. This is an example that the United States will take military action to defend its neutrality and to stand up against any perceived encroachments on their freedoms, especially the freedoms of the sea. Right. The War of 1812 with Great Britain. There's a couple of reasons why we go to war. One is the issue of impressment, and the other is that Great Britain was supplying Native Americans in the West with weapons. And then the Monroe Doctrine. In the 1810s, in the decade 1810 to 1820, we start to see these revolutions happening in Latin America. They're starting to overthrow their colonial powers. And then in 1823, John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, he writes up what will become known as the Monroe Doctrine. It's called the Monroe Doctrine because James Monroe is still president. And with the Monroe Doctrine, it says that the United States will essentially resist any further European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. So basically, the United States is telling Europe, we have this, the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, we got this, all right? And in return, if you guys stay out of the Western Hemisphere, we won't get involved in European affairs. So I think this is also a continuation of the warnings that Washington gave in its farewell address. We'll see the Monroe Doctrine again come up with the debate over whether or not the United States should enter World War I. We see it also being brought up with JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He sees that the Russian presence in Cuba is a direct violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The United States must take action. I believe that is, that's it for period 6. Period 4. Let's see, we got any questions here. All right, we got Tim Smith. Did the slaves fight back in some way after the 1790s? Yeah, we do see some slave revolts. We see the slave revolts of Denmark Vesey in South Carolina in the early 1820s, and we also see Nat Turner's Rebellion in the late 1820s. And it's going to be similar. The reaction will be similar as the Stono Rebellion, where we see stricter slave codes being put into place by the southern states. Okay, all right. I see Sarah Bailey. She answered that. Thanks a lot, Sarah, for making my job a little bit easier. All right, so moving on. All right. All right, period 5. Period 5 takes 1844 through 1877. It's 13% of the final exam. 1844. We've talked about that. This is Manifest Destiny. We start to see the movement west, like the Oregon Trail. We see the election of James K. Polk. James K. Polk is the president that you want to associate with Manifest Destiny. James K. Polk, he's the one that in his platform in 1844, I want Texas. All right, Texas had been had its independence since 1836. It had requested annexation by the United States, but due to the slavery issue, we see the United States delay on annexing Texas. James K. Polk is the president that says, I want the Oregon Territory solely for the United States. It was at the time jointly occupied by the United States and Great Britain. And James K. Polk, I want it 54-40 or fight. He wants the Oregon Territory all the way up to the southern border of Alaska. James K. Polk says, I want California. All right, and so we'll see. We get Texas, right? As a result of his win in 1844, John Tyler will call for a joint session of Congress, and they will vote to annex Texas. We see that he compromises on Oregon. He gets the British to compromise on the 49th parallel. The 49th parallel is the present-day border between the United States and Canada. If you're looking up at the state of Washington, and actually goes all the way through the northern, the border between Canada and the United States, that's the 49th parallel. Essentially, it's just an extension of an agreement that the British and the United States had in 1818. Oh, and we'll get California by way of the Mexican-American War. All right, so Manifest Destiny. This is a belief that America, because of its institutions, like its democratic institutions, its culture, its religion, that they're destined to expand west and take over the continent from sea to sea, right? We talked about the Texas Revolution. The Texas Revolution happens in 1836. In the 1820s, Mexico had offered up land grants to Americans who were willing to settle in Texas. And so we start to see Americans migrate into Texas in the 1820s, the 1830s. However, due to the issue of slavery, Mexico had abolished slavery, and a lot of these Americans that were moving into Texas owned slaves. We see a revolt and a revolution. In 1836, Texas will win independence from Mexico, and they will, once again, going back to what I just said, they will remain a republic or an independent country for 9 years. With Manifest Destiny, another example of this is the Mexican-American War. This happens in 1846 to 1848. James K. Polk wants California. He also wants to settle this border dispute between the United States and Mexico, really on the southern border of Texas. And this is where it all begins, the Mexican-American War. The United States believes that the border between Texas and Mexico is at the Rio Grande River. Mexico believes that it's actually about 130 miles north of that at the Nueces River. There's a skirmish that breaks out in the disputed area. James K. Polk, in his when he asked for a declaration of war from Congress, he states the famous line, "American blood has been shed on American soil." The Mexican-American War is won pretty handily by the Americans, and in 1848 we see the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo signed, and this is going to end the Mexican-American War. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we get California, and then we get what's called or labeled the Mexican Cession. This would be the present-day states of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, parts of Utah, and Wyoming. All right, with Manifest Destiny, moving out west, we see the development of several overland trails. The Oregon Trail would probably be the most famous one. And then I talked about California becoming a state. And it is actually able to become a state so quickly thanks to the gold rush of 1848 and 1849. All right, some other things we need to remember about Period 5 is a decade of crisis, or the 1850s. I would say that the decade crisis really is how slavery, right, and attempts at compromise ultimately failed to prevent this the Civil War. And looking at what sectional tensions existed between the North and the South, even though it doesn't happen in the 1850s, it actually happens at the very beginning of the Mexican-American War. I threw in the Wilmot Proviso in there. It's introduced in 1846, and this is calling for any land and territory that we acquire from Mexico, slavery would be banned. It never passes, but it does show that people are starting to think, and debates are starting to be held about this slavery issue and dealing with expansion. All right, we do have a compromise reached in 1850. The Compromise of 1850. California is going to become a free state. We will see a stricter Fugitive Slave Act in force, which also will ultimately lead to the Underground Railroad. We'll see personal liberty laws, which is the northern states' way of getting around this stricter Fugitive Slave Act. And the last part is, with all this territory that we won with the Mexican Cession, that will be determined by popular sovereignty, or otherwise the or in other words, the residents of that territory will be able to decide if this eventual state will be slave or free. In 1854, a great example of this tension would be the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is it's what am I trying to say? It was created by Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is the Illinois senator, and he's a big supporter of popular sovereignty. He proposes that the territories will decide the issue of slavery by way of popular sovereignty, thinking that Kansas would become slave and Nebraska would become free, and the balance of power would remain the same. What ends up happening here is we see both abolitionists and slave advocates rush to Kansas, and violence break out. This will be known as Bleeding Kansas. It's essentially like a miniature civil war. We also see violence break out as a result of this in the Congress. We see Charles Sumner give a 3-day speech called "Crimes Against Kansas," and in those 3 days he just blasts South Carolina especially, and slavery, the institution, and slave owning states. For their insistence, right, on the expansion of slavery. Charles Sumner is later going to be, beaten up pretty badly by Preston Brooks with a cane, and he'll be out for quite some time. We see the Dred Scott court case. The Dred Scott court case comes in 1857. The Dred Scott court case says that slaves are not citizens; they are property. It says that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional because it is a violation of the Fifth Amendment, and therefore that slavery can, essentially exist anywhere. There are no slave states and free states. Slavery can exist anywhere. It's a huge win for the South and a devastating blow for the North. John Brown in 1859, with his raid on Harper's Ferry, which is it was in Virginia, but it's located in present-day West Virginia. He has a raid on a weapons arsenal, hoping to get these weapons, arm the slaves, and start a slave insurrection. He's caught, he's captured, he's hanged. He's seen as a martyr for the North, and he's seen as like America's first terrorist in the South. Then the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Now remember that Lincoln, the Republican Party, their official stance on slavery, they do not support the expansion of slavery. Lincoln is in his first inaugural address. He says, I don't have the power to get rid of slavery. However, South Carolina and 7 other states, the lower South, they don't believe him. And between Lincoln's election and Lincoln's inaugural address, we see 7 states secede, and the ultimate start of the Civil War. A couple other things here. We want to remember how the North won the Civil War. This is due to a variety of factors. We have military leaders, the industrial capacity of the North, political action really taken by Abraham Lincoln, population, resources, and then some key victories here. So military leaders, I think a couple military leaders here. One would be an example of how the North was at a disadvantage with military leaders, and then a couple others would be good examples of how they helped the North win. George McClellan, he was the early general that Lincoln put in charge actually twice for the Army of the Potomac. George McClellan, he's a brilliant general. The troops love him. He can train the army. However, he has, as Lincoln said, a case of the slows. And a great example of this is at the Battle of Antietam. Antietam is Robert E. Lee's first attempt at invading the North. It comes in September of 1862, September 17th, 1862. And McClellan finds Lee's battle plans, so he's able to prepare for Lee. McClellan actually defeats Robert E. Lee at Antietam, but he doesn't pursue Lee. He allows Lee to get away. Lincoln is furious that McClellan had a chance to really give a devastating blow to Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, and he didn't do it, so he fires McClellan. Antietam is significant for a couple different reasons. It's the single bloodiest day in American history. We have 23,000 casualties in one day, and this is the victory that Lincoln needed so he could issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free the slaves in the Confederacy. Let's see here. Industry, right? The North, with their factory system and their diverse economy, they can make the supplies needed for war relatively easily, while the South has to import these things. And so that's going to result in the North's blockade of the southern coast. Some political action with Lincoln. We have at the very beginning of the war the issue of border states, especially Maryland. Maryland is a border state, it's a slave state that does not secede. So some things that Lincoln does, he suspends a writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is where the government has to essentially give you a reason why they're arresting you and holding you in jail. Lincoln suspends this so he can throw the secessionists in jail and hold them there until Maryland is securely in the Union. They won't secede. Another political action that Lincoln takes is the issue of the Emancipation Proclamation. It goes into effect January 1st, 1863. And once again, it says it only frees the states in the states of rebellion. He does this once again to keep the border states from seceding. He also does this because it adds a moral element to the Civil War. His number one goal was to preserve the Union. That was his primary objective. But now it's to preserve the Union and end slavery. And when you make the war about slavery, this is making it increasingly difficult for Great Britain to get involved on the side of the South. And so that was a brilliant move by Abraham Lincoln. Let's see here. Some other things. Some population. We got 21 million for the North, 9 million for the South. Half of those are slaves. Resources. I think that you could talk about industry. You can also talk about resources with the transportation network. This is going to allow soldiers and supplies to get to the front faster. The North has it, the South doesn't. They also have telegraph lines, so Lincoln can be in direct contact with his generals, and the South doesn't have that. So those are some key resources there, and the key victories. I think Antietam is a key victory. Gettysburg in 1863, that's a key victory. That's the last time that Robert E. Lee will invade the North. It's the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. We see the victory at Vicksburg. Vicksburg is on in the Western Theater. It's located on the Mississippi River. And the Union victory at Vicksburg allows the North to control the Mississippi River. And when you control the Mississippi River, you split the Confederacy into two. So that was a key victory. It actually ends on the same day as Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863. And then I think Sherman's capture of Atlanta and then Sherman's march to the sea are pretty essential. Sherman's capture of Atlanta allows or ensures Lincoln's re-election victory in 1864. And then his march to the sea introduces this element of total war. War is hell, that he's going to include every element of society in this war. He wants to kill the fighting spirit and the morale of the South. In 1865, we see the start of Reconstruction. Reconstruction will go from 1865 to 1877. In what ways was Reconstruction a failure? In what ways was it a success? Some things that you want to talk about. Some examples of Reconstruction. We have the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment will abolish slavery. The 14th Amendment will firmly put into place the laws that were created by the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is going to be, all people born in the United States are citizens, and all naturalized citizens and natural born citizens enjoy, equality, equal protection of the law. And so, the Citizenship Amendment. The 15th Amendment will give the franchise or the right to vote to African American men. Radical Republicans. These are Republicans that want to Republicans in Congress that want to punish the South. They are at odds with Lincoln. Lincoln doesn't want to really punish the South. He wants to make this period of Reconstruction as quick and as easy and as painless as possible. We see that in his second inaugural address when he says, with malice towards none and charity towards all. Radical Republicans, they want to punish the South. And so in 1866, when they win the midterm elections and they have a veto-proof majority in both houses of Congress, they will start what's known as Congressional Reconstruction, where they will split the South up into military districts and take away this more lenient approach to readministration to the Union that Lincoln and his successor after he was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, had put into place. We see some resistance here by Southerners, and so we see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan during the Reconstruction period. We see the development of black codes. Black codes happened before Congressional Reconstruction, and they pretty much strip these freedmen or former slaves of any sort of rights and privileges that you would assume that they would have. We see the development of sharecropping and tenant farming. Sharecropping is when you're a farmer and you're farming on somebody's land, but the landowner will sell you plants, seeds, and all that, or tools, supplies, seeds, and everything. And you also have to give them a share of your crop and your harvest. So this will start a cycle of debt for African Americans in the South. It's essentially going to be like economic slavery. We see Lincoln and Johnson. Lincoln and Johnson both wanted to have a more lenient approach to Reconstruction. And then last but not least, the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was created in 1865, and the whole purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to give clothes, food, any sort of assistance to these newly freed slaves. All right, so before I go to period 6, all right. Yeah, you're right, Overton. That's a really cool fun fact, because we have 2 places of surrender. I believe Bennett's Place in Durham. It was where William Tecumseh Sherman, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, got I believe it was Johnston. I could be wrong. I believe it was Johnston to surrender. And then you have the more well-known one on April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, and that's where Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. I wanted to end around 8 o'clock, so I don't know if I'll be able to get into period 6. I could do period 6 and period 7 tomorrow, or I might just make a video of period 6 tonight or tomorrow during my planning period, because we are running a little short on time, and I would like to focus a lot on period 7 since it's so big, 1890 through 1945, solely on tomorrow. So I might just direct your attention to a review video, or I might put up a review video for period 6. Period 6, 1865 to 1898. It's 13% of your exam, and period 6 deals with westward expansion. All right, so dealing with once again, manifestation, but this is going into the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So we'll look at the impact it had on Plains Indians. We see the Gilded Age and the rise of big business. We see the Populist Party being formed. We see the social Darwinism, the social gospel movement, labor unions. Those are going to be talked about. We also see new immigrants, right? those are the immigrant groups that are coming from South and Eastern Europe. And that is it for period 6. I'm looking just to see if anybody had any extra questions or comments. Is everybody okay with that? If I just make either direct you to a review video for period 6, or I make another one, and we can focus solely on period 7 tomorrow. I'll just wait for your comments. All right. Send pictures of what I went over McDonald over the remind, or send pictures of period 6 over the remind. Which one did you want? Or I guess I could do both. Cool. All right. Well, I can do it. Once again, guys, I can't thank you enough for spending your time in your evening watching me as I try to resemble something that is a quality educator. I'm not saying high quality. I'm just saying quality. But yeah, I appreciate you spending your time. It's 57 minutes is a long time, especially when you have other AP exams and other classes. So I can't thank you enough for participating in this live stream, and I really do. I hope this has been beneficial. I hope that you're getting something out of it, and I hope that we're putting ourselves in a position so we can all be successful come Friday. And I know that doing this, you're you're taking the necessary steps that you need to. So I can't wait to see you guys tomorrow if you're in my B-Day class. For my A-Day kids, I'll see you over the internet, and I'll see you next week. All right, so everybody get a good night's sleep, and I'll talk to you later.